What is happening, y'all? Cowboy here, and today I'm going to be giving you some updated impressions of Nioh 2 based on my recent experience with the beta. Now, I just got back from my 2-week-long honeymoon in Japan. This footage is actually right after I got back in from Tokyo. It was roughly 15 hours of flying. Got home, there were about 3 hours left for the beta, so I jumped straight in, made it through the first boss, and just kind of looked at all the stuff that had been updated. And mainly because I wanted to do a video to see what had changed, because I remember my initial impressions with the alpha, at least, weren't very favorable. And one of the big reasons for that was thinking back to dev interviews for Nioh 2. One of the most memorable things for me was there was a quote in one of the interviews they had during the PlayStation showcase where they said that in Nioh, they didn't really know what they were doing. It was kind of new territory for them. And with Nioh 2, now they know what they're doing. Now they know what people want, and the kids' gloves were coming off. And that got me really, really hyped for Nioh 2 initially. And then when I played the alpha, it very much felt incredibly safe. It didn't feel like the gloves came off at all. It felt just like Nioh 1 with a couple new bells and whistles. And I am happy to say that at least playing through the beta, it does feel like they kind of took off those gloves they were talking about, and there were quite a lot of new things that I ended up enjoying in the beta, more so than in the alpha. So in today's video, we're going to be kind of going through all those things that I wasn't as big of a fan of in the alpha and how they've changed, as well as some of the stuff that has me really looking forward to this game now. So one of the biggest things is the changes to the skill tree. Now initially, one of my biggest complaints about the skill trees were you essentially had your samurai skills, your ninjutsu, your omyo, and then every single weapon had its own dedicated skill tree with its own dedicated passives. And one of my main issues with this was thinking back to Nioh 1, you essentially split skilled between your trees. If you wanted to pick up life, you would dip into the axe tree. If you wanted to pick up final blow damage, you dip into the sword tree. And now all of those skills are in every single weapon's tree. So for example, if you're using dual blades, you don't need to go into any other trees. You can just focus on dual blades and grab every single skill that's in that tree. And it felt kind of brain dead in a sense, you know? It didn't really feel like you had to think about what you were going for. And on one hand, you could argue that it's better for new players, but at the same time, I felt like it would take away from build variety and kind of make everything just essentially follow a straightforward path. So you can see I'm pretty happy here. This was what I thought was a minute before the beta ended. This was like 11:59, and I managed to kill a boss on my final attempt, so pretty hyped about that. Turned out I had like an extra 3 hours of beta time left anyway, but that's beyond the point. So anyway, initially I was kind of upset with that because, you know, like I said, it made skilling up in the trees brain dead. But looking at how the skill tree has evolved between the alpha and the beta, there are quite a few things that have changed. So one of the biggest is we now have a skill tree dedicated to our demon mode where you can invest points in kind of just general demon mode type things, or you can focus on either brute, feral, or phantom. So that's going to add a little bit more variety, and those skill points obviously come from using stuff in that particular tree. In addition, the general trees, your samurai tree as well as your weapon trees, have been fleshed out a little bit better. There's a little bit more interconnectivity between trees and branching skills, so you can kind of swing on into the back and get passives without having to pick up every single ability that's needed. And probably one of the more interesting things that I first noticed in the omyo tree, and I'm not sure if it's in every tree, but you're able to multi-skill into certain abilities. And for example, with lightning shot, you're able to put multiple skill points into lightning shot, and it will decrease the total cost of that omyo with, you know, how expensive it is to equip, in addition to increasing the overall uses of that ability. So I do think with those changes now that the skill trees aren't going to be as straightforward and simple as they were back in the alpha, we're going to see a bit more build variety now with you having to focus on a weapon, anything in omyo or ninjutsu, and then in addition your demon tree. So that was a change that I thought was really nice to see between both the beta and the alpha. Another big thing is obviously the weapons. Back in the alpha, we had pretty limited weapons. You know, we had the dual hatchets that were added in, but quite a few weapons from the base game were missing, and it kind of was like, there's no way this is really it, you know, one new weapon. And now we have all of the previous weapons are returning. You know, the tonfas are there, the spears there, axe, sword, dual swords, but we also have the hatchets, and then we also have the switchglaive, which you'll see me using for the majority of this video, if not all of it, which is a new omyo / magic dedicated weapon, and that's one thing that I'm really happy about. One of my biggest biggest gripes with the alpha was that even after all this time, we still did not have a weapon dedicated for Omyo users. And back in Nioh 1, you usually just went for like a magic A scaling dual blade. And there wasn't really much else. There were a couple tonfas that were kind of, for magic users, but there wasn't a magic weapon, and it always felt like a really odd design decision, especially when you had Kusarigama, that was a weapon designed around scaling up with ninjutsu. And so with them finally having added in a magic scaling weapon, I will say I'm quite happy about that. I thought they were going to go for like a dual fan type thing. So seeing a scythe type weapon was actually pretty badass. The weapon works as a glaive in your low and your mid stance, and then when you go into high stance, it functions as a scythe. So very much kind of like a trick weapon from Bloodborne, if you will. But definitely a cool weapon and a lot of fun with. More than likely, I'll probably end up doing my first run in release as a switchglaive magic type user, and then for the second one I'll probably mess around more with hatchets, which I did like those quite a bit back in the alpha. So anyway, with the weapon having been addressed and then the skill having been addressed, my next big complaint was the enemies. Back in the alpha, it felt like I had encountered more enemies that were enemies that I'd seen before than enemies that were new. And while in the beta there were still quite a few returning enemies, it was the opposite this time. More enemies that I saw out in the world were actually new enemies that I'd never seen before versus yokai that I remembered from the previous game. And this was one of my biggest gripes, because going into the Nioh 2 alpha, for those that played the alpha, you had, I would say, maybe 10 new enemies in the entirety of the alpha, and everything else was just reused assets, reused enemies that you had fought before. And it was kind of disheartening because it felt, like, why was there so much copy paste this time? And you still have a lot of those things. You still have the dwellers, you still have the Magru warrior like you just saw, you still have your basic bitch demon yokai, but there are a lot more, especially in the first level that we play through in the beta. I would say the majority of enemies that you actually encounter in that level are new yokai that you had never seen before. And there were a couple that kind of like really surprised me and freaked me out, where I was like, what the hell is this thing? There was one thing that had like 7 heads and it was crawling around on 4 legs, and I was like, what the hell is that thing? Get it away from me. And just kind of like use skills to cheese and take it on out. But it is really nice to see that they took that into consideration, and they basically just didn't have all the yokai models ready back for the alpha. That's something I'm really happy with. Another thing that is interesting now is there's been an additional move added into all of the demon forms, where it's essentially a yokai counter. So as enemies fight, every now and then you'll notice a red kind of aura that'll flash around the enemy, and it's considered a burst move. If the burst move connects, you're probably going to die. It does a ton of damage, but you're able to counter the boost moves using your yokai counter. So just like you can hit right trigger and square or triangle to do a yokai ability with whatever soul cores you have on, you can hit circle and it will change depending on the type of demon form that you have. If you have on brute, you basically do this pimp slap type thing that counters the enemy. If you have on feral, you do a dashing parry where you kind of rush at them, parry the attack and counter them. And if you have on phantom, you do like a split-second parry that can counter the enemy and get in some respectable damage. So all in all, I am excited about the changes that I saw in the beta, especially as compared to the alpha. We saw a little bit more development into the skill trees, which was one of my major complaints. We got the introduction of a new weapon. We saw a lot more yokai than in the previous game. And so all in all, I do think that Nioh 2 is starting to shape up to look like it'll be pretty damn good. In addition to that, I do think we have one more weapon that's coming that we haven't seen yet. Taking a look at the skill tree here, you'll notice how there's just kind of this open, empty circle between the Kusarigama and the axe, and yeah, I feel like there has to be something they're putting into that spot. We might even see a weapon that ends up at the top and the bottom, just to kind of round out the whole shape. But I definitely think there's at least one more weapon coming that they haven't showcased us yet. So that's obviously all just up in the air and guessing, but it just just looking visually, I feel like that'd be a very unappealing way to place all of your skills and just have this random empty spot on the right. The rest of the stuff is kind of minor, but I will say I like the addition of the courage stat as opposed to spirit. Back in Nioh 1, spirit was, in a sense, a dead stat. You'd only really put points into it to meet the requirements for the particular guardian spirit you were using. And aside from that, I mean, the only time you would level spirit is if you happen to be using one of those spirit weapons. There were like 5 or 6 different spirit weapons in the game, so it was very much a dead stat. Whereas courage, on the other hand, both being dedicated to Tonfa in addition to increasing key recovery, I think that'll actually be a stat that we'll see people speccing into it and will be something that's useful. Another minor thing that is kind of nice to see is how in-depth the character creator is. On the Nioh subreddit, there's been people posting pictures ranging from Geralt to Harley Quinn, and to see that level of depth in a character creator is always nice because you're letting people kind of create their own identity and play their own way. So that is something I got to give them kudos on. Moving forward, though, I'd say probably the biggest thing I still want to see with Nioh 2 is even more enemy variety. And the main reason for this is thinking about games in this Souls-like sphere. I feel that every enemy is an encounter that you have to overcome, especially if it's a new enemy. If it's something you've never seen, you're trying to figure out its moveset, you're trying to figure out what you can do to get past and overcome this enemy, overcome this challenge. And every time we encounter an enemy that we fought in the original Nioh, there's no challenge to overcome. And to that extent, I think that is going to be the most important thing that determines whether or not Nioh 2 is a hit or is just another game that ends up being loved by fans of the original. Because, at the end of the day, the reason that I think we play games like this is because we crave the challenging aspect of it. We crave the super hard combat. We're masochists for the death and the recovery. But I think a huge part of it is also overcoming adversity, and fighting enemies that we fought before is not really overcoming adversity, it's just going through the motions. So I am excited with what I have seen. As I mentioned, the jump from the alpha to the beta was pretty impressive with the amount of enemies they've added, and I can only hope they add more. So for now at least, I am going to mark myself down as hyped again for Nioh 2, as opposed to how I was after the alpha. But either way, we still got about 4 months until launch, with them targeting a March 13th, 2020 launch date, so that is plenty of time for them to add even more polish, add in more yokai, and I definitely have high hopes to see what will happen at release. At least basing things off of the demo cycles of the original Nioh, I do think we'll get another beta a bit closer to launch, probably somewhere in the January-February timeframe that'll have, pretty much what we're going to see at launch at that point. So that'll be something to look forward to. But otherwise, that is going to wrap things up for now. So I do wish I had even more footage. Like I said, very limited time with having just barely gotten in to play this back from Tokyo. But either way, guys, thanks for coming on by and checking it out. Hope you enjoyed the video and appreciate the viewership as always. So with all that being said, I'll catch you guys next time.